Ukrainian robots advanced toward the Russian-occupied village near Pokrovsk, carrying machine guns so heavy that their shots could pierce the walls of the houses where the enemies were hiding. The soldiers and tanks followed it, hoping to take back one of the fastest advances the Russians had made. The Russian tried to enter a trench, but he was in for a surprise. Another Moscow soldier prepared grenades to eliminate the Ukrainians who were hiding in another position. Meanwhile, drones were hunting across the fields while the Russians tried a new strategy, and the Ukrainians did everything they could to try to stop them. The third year of war in Ukraine had a name, just as there was a main name in all the other years. This was Pokrovsk, but before it was Bakhmut and Avdiivka was moving. Now, it was precisely this city, which was an extension of the Avdiivka battle axis, which ended in February 2024. The Battle of Pokrovsk had been going on for over a year when the Russians made an unexpected move. It happened after months of advancing. In August 2025, the Russians had advanced 18 kilometers towards Pokrovsk, a slow but steady progression of 1 kilometer per month. The difficulties in this direct advance led to an attempt at a pincer movement. The attacks to the north allowed an advance of 32 kilometers in the northern direction of Pokrovsk. This progression was faster, with about 2 kilometers per month. The fighting between the two sides was intense. The Russians used their drones to disrupt Ukrainian transports, preventing troop rotation. The bombings destroyed houses in the villages and towns of the region, targeting Ukrainian movements. To prevent the defense troops from settling in, the drone attacks were particularly effective against vehicles on the supply routes. It was becoming increasingly difficult to transport anything toward Pokrovsk, raising the human and equipment cost. To keep the city and villages supplied for an effective defense, the Russians tried to choke off the routes that kept the resistance alive in the region, something they knew worked very well, to maintain their steady advances and take control of the main cities. The cost for the Ukrainians became clear in the growing number of destroyed vehicles. Some were still burning from recent attacks. Many of them still had bodies trapped in the wreckage. Men who were suddenly struck by the drone plague. Once again, the war left behind a cemetery of metal on Ukrainian soil, with twisted sarcophagi in the form of war equipment, where the bodies of the fighters rested. The Ukrainians began to realize that the fighting in the region had long since stopped involving large columns, with BTRs or BMPs carrying soldiers to try to take the main trenches. Suddenly, their drones started picking up lone men walking through the fields easily, some trying to disguise themselves as best as they could while carrying their rifles. When they saw a drone, they tried to hide, but the kamikaze team would soon send a demon to hunt down that lost soul in the war. That smoldering body was a clear sign of a change in the war. Vesely, Ukrainian drones dove against more and more Russians on the battlefields north of Pokrovsk, mainly toward villages like Vesely and Counterattack. These soldiers were sometimes called pedestrians, men who walked alone or in small groups through the fields, hiding among the trees and trying to escape the drones. An unsuspecting observer might say they were mere scouts with so many civilians in wars. But this was not a war like the others. Before, there weren't kamikaze drones flying like swarms of bloodthirsty demons. Sometimes the Ukrainians noticed that when a Russian advanced, a larger group of soldiers or a group of dead would follow the same path, judging that it was a gap, a weaker sector where the advance wasn't noticed or properly stopped. That region didn't have the same level of mobilization. Russians bombarded the weak Ukrainian defenses in that direction. The fuel-air bombs took lives with the hellish heat and violence they unleashed on the ground. The drones waited on the roads, trying to further fragment the defenses. They would fly when they saw a target, ambushing vehicles and soldiers. Even the attempt to supply Ukrainian soldiers using heavier drones to drop supplies was thwarted by kamikaze drones, destroying the Ukrainian hexacopters. Meanwhile, the trenches felt the impact of more drones and bombs. In places with few defenses, the Russians managed to enter the trenches, sometimes shooting, just like in training. The rapid aftermath Kalashnikova shots could only stop for a magazine change. Already near the Ukrainian hideouts, they threw grenades where the enemies were hiding. The explosions killed the soldiers in those weakened defenses. Other Ukrainians simply retreated when they realized the Russian waves were getting bigger and bigger, following those lone soldiers who had gone in. When they noticed the opening in the defenses, Moscow's infantry advanced almost 20 kilometers in about 6 days, arriving at Counterattack and Vesely between August 8-15, 2025. It was a sudden and frightening advance that caused a furor among the Russians. This kind of breach in the Ukrainian defenses was usually followed by a sequence of overwhelming territorial takeovers. A larger number of troops soon followed, but the initial shock that made so many Ukrainians retreat was soon followed by orders that repositioned troops, like the 414th Unmanned Attack Aviation Brigade. The 414's drones began to descend quickly on the Russians, finishing off many of the men hiding who were still trying to communicate their position to their leaders. The 414th was founded by the businessman and Ukrainian volunteer fighter Robert Bovdy, known by the codename Magyar. In April 2022, during operations in the Kherson direction, he started using drones for aerial reconnaissance and created the specialized unit Birds of Magyar. Integrated into the 59th Motorized Brigade, it was only in 2024 that the group became a brigade. The Ukrainian response from other brigades began as early as August 15. Troops from the 93rd Brigade began moving toward Vesely, entering the village for combat. The powerful shots from the cannon were followed by the infantry, searching for the Russians among the houses. The men had to be careful when entering any building. An enemy who was hiding could surprise a squad and cause considerable casualties. The village began to burn. The columns of smoke showed how violent the fighting was. The Ukrainian squads managed to surround some Russians. The drone and bombing attacks made some small groups of Moscow fighters start to surrender. It wasn't just soldiers and tanks that headed to Vesely. Unmanned ground vehicles, or ground drones, made their appearance too. The TW droid was one of these, a track-ground robot designed for reconnaissance missions and direct attacks. Its guidance system combined manual and automatic control, with artificial intelligence support, allowing it to identify and attack targets with high-precision combat. In different combat conditions, equipped with a 12.7 mm M2 Browning machine gun, it moved through the streets of Vesely, shooting and engaging targets up to 1 kilometer. It was slow, but it had a tactical operating range of 5 kilometers and a total range of 25 km. The Browning's shots pierced brick walls, wood, thin concrete, or lead metal. In the city's more fragile houses, each shot went through both the external and internal walls. 50 caliber ammunition had enough energy to neutralize a human target, even with an indirect hit like fragments or ricochets. When some Russians escaped from the TW droids, the kamikaze droids came down to execute those men. The tanks also came to start blowing up the houses where the men were hiding. Their cannons unleashed fury on the residences, with shots so close that the Russian corpses were torn apart simply by the kinetic energy of the shells passing through the walls. After some time, the infantry entered Vesely just to capture a few Russians who were still alive. But that didn't mean the fighting was over. The Russians sent even more troops toward Vesely. One of their infantry transport vehicles escaped the drones and managed to reach a trench protected by men from the 71st Jager Brigade. They got out of the transport already under a rain of grenades that the two Ukrainian soldiers threw. Some Russians were already wounded by the explosions. The defenders had left the grenades within reach so they could throw them as quickly as possible. The Russian transport left, leaving the soldiers for the attack and some wounded still on the ground. They walked among the trees, feeling the heat from the grenade explosions. Gas drone even exploded right in front of the Russians, taking down another one in the trench. The others had to hurry even more so they wouldn't be engulfed by the explosions. One of them was too hasty, approaching the ditches and being met by a volley of gunfire, which made him slip into the Ukrainian trench like a corpse. Another one arrived more slowly, but his cautious steps didn't earn him a more polite reception. He rolled over, coughing up his own blood, and joined his assault companion in death. The Ukrainians saw the bodies piled up, but they knew the job was not done yet. The Russians tried to get closer using the dead. They were faster, but death found them just as quickly. The pets of the deceased were collected as trophies by the defenders. The battles were not over yet. The Russians had the Ukrainians in their sights. When Kiev's troops began to improve some of the defenses in the areas they had retaken, the Air Force was called in. A Su-34 flew from one of the occupied regions, getting about 80 kilometers away from the target. It dropped the fuel air bombs all at once and left. While they glided toward the trench, their drops completely eliminated the Ukrainian position. The 30th Brigade deployed its drones to destroy one of the hideouts reinforced by the Ukrainians in the village. After the explosion, the soldiers grabbed what they could and started running among the rubble and trees. It was too exposed a position. There were few places to hide after so much destruction. All along the way, the drone gave away their escape, pointing out to the artillery where death should fall. The explosion knocked the soldiers down and made the bodies disappear. In the middle of the smoke, there were spies from both sides of the sky. One of them has now revealed the Russians' position, which gave a kamikaze the opportunity to destroy the hideout. They ran away, but another drone shattered their bodies with an explosion. The M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system, multiple launch rocket system made its appearance in these battles. Blowing up more Russian positions, the Russian commanders kept sending their subordinates toward Vesely, even though their path was blocked. They were rushed and dangerous orders. After losing their vehicles to drone strikes, the soldiers were forced to walk. They were stopped when cluster munitions started exploding around them. Cluster munitions were designed to release multiple sub-munitions or bomblets over a wide area. The bomblets generated metal fragments that quickly scattered in all directions when they exploded, piercing the Russian bodies. Some assault groups of the dead persisted on the path, trying to gain positions in the direction of Vesely. But without realizing it, some Russians had already secured a defensible position in the village, detected long before they reached a place where they could hide. They were taken down by kamikaze drones. The explosions that followed began to hunt these men relentlessly among the trees or out in the open field. These were lives lost after an irresponsible order sent them to a place that was more about propaganda than a viable defense. The most ironic thing is that the advance toward Vesely was overwhelming. But the commander's eagerness to send so many troops forward, instead of securing the areas they had taken, led to the loss of many soldiers. The Russian commander's mistake not only cost lives, but also the possible loss of an unprecedented result that year in the direction of Pokrovsk. In 3 days, Vesely was already retaken, and the Russians further south were surrounded by Ukrainian troops. However, the fighting would not end so easily. That would be a new front where death would celebrate for some time yet.